His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told T-bone dance won't ever get old.
Hello and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz. I'm your host, and our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. Today starts the first of a two-part mini-series on the Southold Indian Museum. SoutholdIndianMuseum.com. We'll be releasing them back-to-back, so you'll get the next in about 24 hours. But we start out with their future executive director and today's very special guest.
My name is Jay Levenson. Last name is my wife's. She's of the Jewish faith, and when I married her, I took her name because the women are the keepers, life givers, and we marry into their family, so I took her last name.
And is that, just to dive into it, is that part of your cultural heritage, that concept or that custom?
Not necessarily the name change, but the concept that when a man marries a woman, you're marrying into their family, yes. The women actually had a lot more power and say than Europeans did at the time. So yeah, traditionally, yes.
That's great. And I'll also say up front, Jay, for full disclosure, you and I worked together. We were both at Stony Brook Libraries for a while. But I appreciate you coming on, so thank you. We're going to be talking about the Native American Museum in Southold, but we also want to get a little bit of your background. Do you want to say a little bit about yourself and how you came to be aware of the museum?
I found out late in life of my Mohawk history and background, and started getting involved with research and involved in historical reenacting, 18th century historical reenacting, where I portray a Mohawk scout aligned with the British. Been doing that for about 20-something years. Met my wife on the internet. We got married. She had a practice down here, so I moved down here. And she introduced me to the museum. One of the things she wanted to take me out there, and she said, I got to take you out to the museum. So when I moved down here 14 years ago, we went out there. And the funny thing is, when she took me there, right across the street from the museum is the Custer, C-U-S-T-E-R, Observatory. Right across the street from the Indian Museum. And I used an expletive and said, who was the person that came up with this idea to put the museum right across the street from a Custer Observatory. So I found that humorous. And I knew that it was there for quite a while. And several years ago, I contacted them and asked if I could be involved. And they were more than interested in having me on board. I'm the only person of Native heritage currently on board. And I joined the Board of Trustees and I've been doing that for about 5 or 6 years, and was contemplating retiring from Stony Brook, and stated that, I'd be interested in working there. And I'm now been offered the executive director's position, which hopefully I'll be starting in January.
Well, that's great. Congratulations on that move. And just to stick on some of the things you've said, we've interviewed a number of people. John Strong and Gaynell Stone and other people have studied this period or the culture of Native Americans on Long Island, but we haven't spoken to, other than Jeremy Dennis of the Shinnecock and a few others, actual Native Americans. And so forgive me if any of these are naive questions, but when you mention finding later in life about your heritage, can you maybe dive into that a little or unwrap how that occurred?
My mother revealed that, and it was something that because during that time period in the 50s, 60s, 40s, you didn't talk about it. So if there was any Native blood in your heritage, you kind of covered that up. And it wasn't until later in life when my mother revealed that my grandfather had Native blood. And
how has your reaction to that change, or has it changed over time? Is that something you were excited about, or?
I'm just like anybody else. I'm proud of my heritage, whether it be my European background or my Native American background. I'm proud of all, my heritage. They're my ancestors, and I think everybody should be proud of their heritage and where they came from. You respect your elders, you respect your past, and so, this was something that just added to my interest and my the richness and vastness of my history.
And the other thing, just to hopefully inform listeners too, the geography and the map of pre-contact Northeast, at least. So when you say Mohawk, can you give us a general sense of that, what area they would have been most inhabiting?
The Mohawk are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, or what you commonly refer to as Iroquois. Iroquois is Iroquois is what our enemies, the Huron, who are also Iroquois-speaking people, but not part of the Confederacy, called us. And that meant snakes. We call ourselves Haudenosaunee, which is people of the Long House. It was a confederacy of 5 nations made up of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, Tuscarora. Come in around 1722. The Tuscarora come from down the Carolinas, and they come up and join the Confederacy and make it into the 6 Nations. It's upstate New York. It runs basically from right around Albany, a little bit west of Albany, where the Mohawk territory was, and all the way out towards Niagara, where the Senecas are, in the upper New York State in the Adirondacks area, and the Great Lakes and the Finger Lakes area. Okay.
So, I mean, and again, I'm coming from my own perspective, but the fact that these peoples are still there, but also that not many know the real history or the true history, and just the fact, like you mentioned, the Iroquois being a racial slur in a sense, the way we teach these things should probably change as we get more aware of the origins of some of the terms we're using.
Right. Well, the Mohawk also is it's not so much a slur as it was just what our enemies called us in the French. It's because of the French. The French actually picked that up, and that's what they used in relation to us. Mohawk is actually a translation, and it would be man-eaters. But we were actually the keepers of the flint, or keepers of the stone, because our area, our territory, if you want to say that, encompassed an area where flint was found that was good for making arrows. And there's some controversy about that because some people also think it might be keepers of the stone, because Herkimer diamonds are also in our territory, and that's where you find the Herkimer diamond. So there is a little bit of controversy, but most people say it's keepers of the flint.
And it's also fascinating. So we'll bring this back a little. So the museum that we're discussing is in Southold, which is on the North Fork, and just the patterns of movement. And so the connection of the North Fork to the Connecticut shoreline, the Rhode Island shoreline, and the groups of the Native Americans there. Do you want to talk, or can you speak to the movements of peoples and how the North Fork is related to the whole structure that you were just describing in the Northeast?
They're the northeastern woodland peoples. They're Algonquins. When you say Algonquins, that's the language. Same with Iroquois. Iroquois is a language. So the Europeans grouped people by language. So if you spoke an Iroquoian dialect, you were considered Iroquoian. The Hurons, the Fox Sox, some of those other nations that spoke an Iroquoian language, they were categorized as one group. And then you had the Algonquins, who were living along the Hudson River and out west. So they were kind of intermingled with the Haudenosaunee. And then you have them down here in New York City, and you have them here on Long Island. It was a trade network. Okay, so the Iroquois would have had contact with the Algonquins, especially when it came to wampum. So there was, trade. There was a period of time where actually they were paying tribute. The Algonquins on Long Island were paying tribute to the Mohawks for a period of time in wampum. But it was a trade network. So everybody was aware of everything, and there was a huge trade network. I mean, they were trading, the Haudenosaunee themselves, the territory that they ended up in control of at the height of their control, stretched all the way from Canada down to the Carolinas, where they were fighting another Algonquin nation, all the way west to the Mississippi and all the way up into Vermont, New Hampshire. So you can't really say territory because they didn't really have territory, but they spread out. Their control spread out, and they forced different peoples out. And but as far as here on Long Island, it was really just basically a trade relationship with the Haudenosaunee, and they were very peaceful people down here on Long Island.
And, just from speaking to the people I've spoken to, it was much easier to get from Connecticut to the North Shore than, say, east-west along the island. So it's interesting that there's sort of the Nassau-Queens border seems to harken back to a lot of changes of peoples in terms of, I think the Lenape were more the western end
Right.
of the island, Queens and Brooklyn, and then it does shift into the peoples you're describing for the rest of the island.
Right. There are two different dialects. So when you get Nassau County, that was one dialect of Algonquin. They were still Algonquin people, but they had their own dialect. And then when you get past that, the Algonquins out here, they were still Algonquin. They're all relatives, had a different dialect. Unfortunately, there is this misunderstanding as far as nations or tribes on Long Island. So, a lot of people refer to it as the 13 nations or 13 tribes. That's inaccurate. It was actually villages. And if you look into the names of the various communities, as far as the Settlecott, the Montaukett, the Shinnecock, the Unkachug, these were names of places. So when the Europeans came, they had to, in order to be able to reference individuals, they said, you're a tribe. But they were actually villages. I mean, they were within 1-2 days walking distance of each other. They were intermarried. They would consider themselves people of the rising sun. So they were all interrelated.
Well, it's interesting. So you mentioned, the people of the stone, and one of the translations one of the names for Long Island was Island of Shells, and the whole concept of wampum. Can you say anything about that? What you would want people to know?
Well, wampum was a very important trade item. It was not money. It was not Indian money. That's a misnomer. It was actually turned into currency by the Dutch, and then later the English and the French. The Dutch used it as currency because when they came here, they had no money with them. They didn't bring coins and things. And they realized how valuable this item was as far as, a trade item. And they took that upon themselves. This was, in Connecticut and here on Long Island, this was a major production site for wampum. Wampum is made from the quahog shell and the whelk shell. The whelk shell, the inner spine is taken out and used for the white beads. And then for the purple, you would use the quahog shell. And it was so dark back in the day that they actually considered it a black bead. It was so dark purple. These beads were used, especially among my people, to make belts. These weren't belts that you wore. These were belts that were sort of like a written document. They were mnemonic devices used for recording anything from a treaty to a historic event. They would be put into strings to call for nations to come together. They would be woven into belts to call for war or to signify peace treaties between nations or between the Europeans. There was generally somebody within the nation that was charged with knowing word for word what each belt meant. And they were the belt keepers or the wampum keepers. And it was a very important aspect. Right down the road from the museum is Fort Kuchog, which in the 1600s was actually considered like the Fort Knox of New England, because again, money was scarce. So it was being produced at Fort Kuchog for the Dutch in large quantities, barrels full. And one of the reasons that the Dutch and then the English and the French wanted the wampum is because they could go to a place called New Amsterdam, which is now New York City, as you know, and load that onto ships and travel up the Hudson to another place called Fort Orange, which later becomes Albany. And those beads were used to be traded for pelts. The most important pelt was the beaver pelt.
So when you first came into the museum or when you first started visiting it, what was your reaction or your sense of their mission and the collections that they had?
Well, the museum is an older museum. And one of the reasons why I've come on board is to try and turn the museum around, to give it a new future, a new look, a new goal as far as what we want to represent. Working with Lucinda, the current president of the museum, we're trying to bring it into the 21st century. make it more relevant, and work more with the nations and become more of a research-based facility, and to back the nations as far as preservation and the telling of the story of the people of Long Island, not just from the ancient past, but also up to the present time. And also not only Long Island nations, but we also have collections from other nations around Turtle Island and down into South America. So we're trying to tell the story of Native Americans in general and trying to show people the differences. Unfortunately, thanks to Hollywood, everybody thinks that when you say Native American, the first thing that comes to people's minds is the war bonnet and the tomahawks and, riding horses. And that's not what Native Americans were. That's Hollywood. And not all Native Americans wore war bonnets and rode horses. So we're trying to tell the stories the way they should be told.
And what in the collections do you think are you excited about using to tell the story, or can help you tell the story effectively?
That's a good question. We have everything from a Clovis and Folsom Point that were found here on Long Island, and that's like the earliest Paleo Native American, or Paleo Indian is what they're called, arrival here on Long Island. So you're talking 10, 15, 20,000 years ago. We have a wonderful set of pottery that was found on the island, and the older pottery that we found, or that was found by the museum, actually is created from a stone that was collected in Connecticut. So there's that trade relationship again between Connecticut, the Algonquins in Connecticut, to the ones here on the island. And then they discover how to work with clay, and they start making pots. And we have one of the largest, and I'm sure Lucinda will mention this as well, we have one of the largest Algonquin pottery collections in the country. We also have some wampum, some original wampum that was made here on Long Island. And we have things that, people can compare the Long Island peoples to other peoples, that were here well before and currently still existing here on Turtle Island.
And I was just looking at the website, and you've got some items photographed and digitized and on display. And mm-hmm. I was not surprised, but it was interesting to see there were some pipes. So I don't know if you've looked at those specifically, but is there anything to say about the use of pipes and what they might have been smoking, or what role smoking played for Native Americans?
They were smoking tobacco, along with other herbs, depending on the nation. Tobacco is a sacred plant. It's one of the first plants to spring up in the springtime. It was not used like today. It wasn't manufactured and manipulated to make it more of more tar, more nicotine. That wasn't what tobacco was. I've actually tried Native American tobacco, and it's a totally different thing than what you buy in the stores. It's a sacred thing. Tobacco is used to offer for prayers, to give to elders. The smoke rises, so your prayers rise up to the Creator. And again, it depends on the individual nation as to what they consider what they use tobacco for. But tobacco is one of those general things that links almost all Native people together.
So in terms of the role you're stepping into and the mission of the museum, what's your sort of ideal? What would you like to see happen in terms of people's awareness of the museum, people's awareness of these cultures on Long Island? Like, what's your best case scenario? What would you like to see happen?
Ideally, we'd like to make sure that people know that we exist. Unfortunately, it's been in my experience that a lot of people don't even know that we're there. We are a very small museum. It's really run by volunteers. I'm the first employee in a long time that the museum has had. Want to introduce new programming, and try to work with the nations, get the nations involved with the museum, which we have been doing with help with the Sugarloaf Hill site. We're trying to give them the records that we have to help them preserve that site, and hopefully to preserve other sites on the island, and to help them with their history and to tell their story, but not tell their story to a point where these were the people. It should be these are the people, because they're still here. So I want to see us change that perspective by telling people that this is Native American lands that you're on. These Native people are still here. and this is part of their history, just a part, and hopefully expand that to modern day.
No, that's great. And just as a straight thought, how does this compare to similar activities in upstate New York or further north? Like, so where you came from, is the same type of work being done to tell these stories? Do you see a movement happening, or is everyone sort of struggling to do the same thing independently? Or
No, there's definitely a movement. A lot of nations, including the Shinnecock, have their own museums, and they're trying to tell their own stories because, quite frankly, the museums and the collections that have been previously in existence were collected and told by non-native people. So when it comes to museums, they're trying to tell their story, not have it interpreted by somebody outside, but to tell their actual story and what it means to be a person of their different nations. So it's definitely something that's nationwide. This museum is privately owned. It's not affiliated with any particular nation. So the goal here is to do like the Museum of the American Indian in New York City or Washington, to bring Native peoples into the fold and to try and assist them with knowing about their past and telling their story in their way. Little things like the fact that during the American Revolution, the people on Long Island were having issues with the British coming and stealing their cows and sheep and things, and they would hire Shinnecock and other Algonquin people to watch over the herds, or the fact that they were indentured. A lot of the Algonquin people that stayed here on Long Island became indentured servants to Europeans and assisted in keeping the homes and such, because they lost their land base, those that stayed here. And people get the wrong impression of Native people, especially where when you come to the Shinnecock and their issues with the Hamptons, which I think it's starting to change, because the Hamptons and the Peconic Land Trust have come in and helped them purchase the Sugarloaf Hill, which is a Native burial site and a very sacred, one of their most sacred sites on Long Island. And that's a wonderful thing. I think it's great that they're getting that back and they're able to preserve it and research it. And they're trying to learn the history behind it, and where it fits into their story, their narrative.
yeah, and not to open a whole new train of thought, but from what I read, your museum, it was founded out of an impulse of a lot of, I don't know if you would say amateur archaeologists, but people that were finding items in the landscape that were not controlled by the Native Americans anymore. So there's, depending on how you look at it, there's a history of people finding things out of context or collecting them without knowing the context. So having control of the sites by the natives is key, I would think.
Well, it's key, but it's sacred sites. I mean, these are important to. They're trying to reclaim their language. As you know, in Stony Brook, they're doing the Algonquin language reclamation. It's all part of trying to reclaim who they are and to let people know that they're still here and they're still in control of their own destiny. One of the things that the museum has done, and they started this before I came on board, and then I became active in the closing of this, was the repatriation of remains, along with artifacts. Obviously, human remains were dug up, and they end up in all museums. I mean, they're still in the Museum of the American Indian. We decided to do the right thing and return them. Archaeologists went through the collection. Anything that was related to remains was collected, returned. They called me in and asked me to give my opinion on certain items, burial items and other things that they had in the collection, and they were returned. So that's the step in the right direction. We want to get away from having things in the collection that we shouldn't have, but on the same point, they also want to preserve it so that future generations of Native Americans can see it, they can research it, they can understand the history, and we want to get them more aligned with the museum so that together we can help with their storytelling, telling their story.
Before we wrap it up, is there anything I haven't asked you or anything you want to get across?
People here, here on Long Island, there are no colleges, no places of higher learning that concentrate on the archaeological history of Long Island, not just Native American. I mean, we're talking colonial period up. No institution here on Long Island, which is kind of sad, helps with that. There was a period that Stony Brook actually had somebody on board that was helping. But since then, since that person retired, it's really just not taught. The same with the schools. And it shouldn't just be taught under the local perspective. It should be taught as far as, what did different Native peoples offer? What did they contribute to this country? Just in speaking about the Haudenosaunee, because that's what I can really speak about. I'm not here to tell the story of the Algonquin people. I'm here to help the Algonquin people tell the story, if I can. It's their story, so it's not my place to go out there and tell people about it, just to make them aware of it. But I can speak to a lot about my Haudenosaunee connections and the contributions that they made, from everything from the Constitution and the formation of the Union. Just to give you an example, in 1754, there's something called the Albany Congress, which they don't teach in school. But this was a very important conference that was called by the then governor of New York and other governors in other states, or actually colonies at the time, to try and repair their relationship with the Haudenosaunee people and other nations. And there was a second part of this Congress, which is a plan of union. And a gentleman by the name of Benjamin Franklin goes there. And he presents this plan of union to the colonies. And he basically says that, to paraphrase, if a bunch of heathen savages can come together and form a union, why can't we? And he actually says this. And that's where the whole notion of bringing the unions together comes from. It was people seeing, it was Benjamin Franklin and others looking at the Haudenosaunee and other Native American nations and seeing true democracy and what true democracy was. Up until that time, there were no nations, and I challenge you. And I had a speaker come to Stony Brook University, Doug George, who also challenged people to look through history and find any other culture, any other civilization in Europe that had true democracy. There is none. I mean, I know people point to Rome and Greece, but in Rome and Greece, the only people that had the right to vote were the rich, the senators. If you were poor, if you were a woman, you had no power, no say. That was different here. Women had control, actually, of the homes and of the lands and the children. They had a say in who was the leadership. Everybody had a say. And if you didn't come together in one mind, things were, not done. So that was a contribution. Native Americans have contributed to this land through the military, through building, through sharing of their knowledge. And I think it's important that people know that we're still here, we're still contributing, and what we've contributed.
So in terms of the museum out in Southold, if people listen to this in December, what can they look forward to? What do you want to make them aware of? Any dates or openings or changes coming up?
Well, right now, currently, the museum is in the process of updating the museum building itself. Once that is done, the goal would be to get programs centered around different aspects of Native American culture, whether it be the Strawberry Festival or the Green Corn Festival, to have programs where we can bring children and have them play games that are Native American and not just lacrosse, but other Native American games so they can feel what it was like. And we have some property behind the museum, and that I've proposed that if we can get volunteers and such, we can build a small replica of what a village would have been like. Have a small wigwam and a small garden and other things that are related to the Fort Kerchog site, which again is right down the road. to help interpret that so that people have an understanding of how they used to live here on Long Island as compared to other nations, that, they didn't live in teepees.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking that the difference is they're not all the same, right? The Hollywood stereotype. And one last thing, you mentioned language, and I realize the dialect or language you may know was not necessarily spoken on Long Island, but could you leave us with any type of Haudenosaunee sign off or greeting or goodbye or whatever you would want to contribute?
Actually, just to kind of set you straight on the words, a lot of the Algonquin words are still used for locations here on Long Island. Massapequa, Montaukett. What you call Setauket was actually Settlecott. Settlecott lands and Settlecott, they changed it to Setauket. So a lot of your locations and sites on Long Island, they still use the Algonquin words. So it's not gone. It's just people just don't know, or they don't care, one or the other. So that's another aspect that we want to get out there. You're on Algonquin lands, and some of your sites are named after the Algonquins that were here, and you should always respect those that were here before you. But as far as for me to sign off, I would say Naiwe Goa, which is thank you for having me, and Ona, we'll speak later.
And thank you again to Jay. We were recording that over Zencastr. You can find links to related resources in our show notes at longislandhistoryproject.org. That will include links to the museum and more of the things that we spoke about today. If you want to get in touch with us, you can reach the podcast at longislandhistoryproject@gmail.com. If you have your own story to tell or want to suggest a guest, we'd be happy to hear from you. And all we ask is that you share us with a friend. Find that podcast lover in your life, send them the link, let them know that there is a podcast out there dedicated to Long Island history. Our outro music is Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. And Jay told us today the story. Tomorrow we will get the science. We will finish this 2-part mini-series with the museum's current president, Arkansas native scientist Lucinda Hemmick.
On Long Island, you sort of have a perfect opportunity to exploit the fish and shellfish, etc. So these huge shell middens that we have on Long Island are fascinating to me too, because just like a Roman trash heap, a shell midden can be studied from the top down, and a collection of shell middens that we have from the Glen Cove area in Nassau County yielded some artifacts that are of a type of around 6,000 years ago.
And that does it for this episode. As always, thank you for listening.